Okay, cool. So, as I mentioned, we are ABA across environments in Colorado Springs. And I have Cassie and Tommy, who are BCBAs with us here at the company. But I also have Annie, who is one of our RBTs. She's actually our director of advocacy. So she does a lot of coordinating with both our RBTs as well as our caregivers. And then I think we might have somebody else joining us a little bit later on, but I'm not going to put any pressure for that to happen. So if y'all have any questions before we get started, I'm happy to help. If not, we're going to move right along. Oh, one thing I will say is the recordings or the pictures are kind of showing up weird. So I can't see everybody's faces really well. So go ahead and interrupt if you have something to say, or you can use the little raise hand if you want to. Okay, cool. So our hope today is to explain a little bit more about what trauma-informed care is, right? We've all kind of heard it. A lot of us are trauma-informed care practitioners already, right? But I also want us to talk about a lot about what our code of ethics say and why that actually matters whenever it comes to being a trauma-informed care provider. And then also where that code then aligns with trauma-informed care practices. So our hope is that you'll be able to have a little bit more understanding about trauma-informed care practices, the framework of how trauma-informed care works within our ethics and why that matters, and then also how it aligns. So in my professional opinion, I do believe that our code is pretty well aligned with these practices, and we're going to talk about how. Okay. So as we read this quote, which of course is not a behavior analytic quote at all, right? What does it mean to you? Anybody can jump in or chat in. Okay, well, I'll share. So when I think about this, it means all lives are shapeable, right? That we're part of the means available to these children and their families. So to me, it makes me evaluate what I'm adding to this person's canvas or their sculpture, right? We often talk about like their learning history, but this is just like a more artfully worded way of saying that, right? So I want everybody to kind of keep this in mind as we're moving forward. But before we do, does anybody have anything else they'd like to add?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with like the learning history. Everybody's life is a little bit of their own making, their own learning history, and we get to be a part of that instead of, kind of enforcing our values. We have to blend with what their artwork is.
Yeah, exactly. Blend it in, right? Like, what are we creating here? Are we making it a really beautiful canvas, right? Or like landscape, or are we making this kind of distorted or, not something that is nice to look at, if you will. So why? Why does this matter today? Why are we doing this? Why does it matter if our practices are trauma-informed or not? And why does it matter if it's aligned with our code of ethics? I'm going to ask y'all a question. This time, y'all can participate with the little hand raise if you want to, or speak out, of course. So raise your hand if you have learners or have had learners in the past who have been adopted or were in their grandparents' care. Yep. Have experienced or are currently experiencing poverty. And how many of those were diagnosed with only ADHD? Or maybe they did have an autism diagnosis, but you're like, this child doesn't have autism. So what do you think that might lead us to believe based on some of these things that we've observed, right? Because I see a lot of you, right? Most of us have our hands raised. Okay, so this is what the research says. There is a prevalence of ADHD diagnoses with children with histories of trauma. I didn't make this one up, right? This one's actually in the Body Keep score on page 109. And how many of these learners have limited, and sorry, this is a question for y'all. How many of these learners have like a limited medical history, or like we don't have a lot of information about how it happened in their past, right? A lot of mine, at least. Or we know some and we're like, ooh, that probably doesn't sound good based on what I've heard, but we also don't know a ton. It's important. That matters. That's the population of learners that we're working with. So what we found was that we were seeing these behavioral responses that some of our ABC data just couldn't account for, right? And it seemed to be exasperated by some of our really well-known interventions like extinction or just like traditional DRA, or my favorite DRA where you present the demand to like engage in a coping skill, right? Sorry, that was a little bit of sarcasm there. It's like my least favorite thing to do. Okay. But it was also one of the things that I have done in the past. So I wasn't considering these learners' unique histories. And it's interesting because we're really taught to think about all of these histories, right? When we think about social validity. But it's something that we just kind of gloss over a lot of times whenever we're actually working with the clients or working with our learners. So this is why. I'm also, and this is just kind of from like a professional and social media standpoint, I'm kind of tired of seeing our code of ethics for behavior analysts and for RBTs being weaponized, right? There's really nothing in our code that says that should be used as a threat. It's supposed to be the opposite, which we're intended to inform and educate the alleged violator, right? And that doesn't mean that we then use punitive measures. Even if that person says that they knowingly did something, right? We can still educate them about why that might not have been the best choice. And maybe there were some other things that like some alternatives, right? I've been in that situation before. I think we all have been in kind of a situation where you're like, oh, so well, it was probably not the most ethical thing. And now I recognize that, right? So here we are talking about how maybe this can improve our practices just that much more because we're really kind of going through this with a fine-tooth comb. All right, let's talk about this a little bit more. And I want us to talk about now how our code is really designed to protect all parties, right? So that in itself is trauma informed, right? Okay, any questions before we get started? Okay, any comments or feedback before we get started? Okay. Whoops. Okay, again, this is one of my other reasons why. We're dismissing some of our science because we aren't accounting for what is going to be most effective for this learner. That's something that we have to do, right? It's part of that individualization that we're doing. So I sometimes get in a huff about single subject research, but the reality is that many of the learners with whom we work really, really do benefit from that single subject research design because they in themselves are very much individualized. So we can see some interventions that might work for one learner is not going to work for another, right? That's kind of why single subject is somewhat important whenever we're thinking about this. So when we think about this kind of like appropriateness for what we need to do, sometimes those mass trial interventions are not going to be what's most appropriate for our learners. And that's kind of my little side note about single subject. So I also think about this whenever I think about pairing practices. We actually refer to this as establishing the therapeutic relationship at our company. And that's just because traditionally, like pairing is really known as operant conditioning, right? So you pair yourself with something good, but we forget that sometimes this can lead to like pliance, or it can also be traumatizing based on that learner's history. Yeah, I heard somebody, so yes, Rose post or Rachel, yeah, somebody did post that, like the word pairing kind of makes them cringe. I saw the same. And I would have to kind of agree with that, in all honesty. But when we're thinking about this kind of practice too, we have to think about that learner's history, right? We're going back to that individual, going back to their learning history. So when we think about this, I want us to think about this particular example. Let's say that you have a learner who has an inconsistent relationship with their bio mother and lives in a foster home. Now, the bio mom visits some, but often brings toys that break or has other kind of like fleeting moments of fun that are inconsistent, right? It's like a fairy tale and lasts for a bit, but then the fairy tale ends and then reality comes back, bio mom leaves, and the child's left simply with a broken toy and then wondering when their mom is going to return again to rescue them, like at the end of the fairy tale, right? So foster mom is then left to pick up all of those pieces. That's hard. That's a hard place to be. But I want us to think about this relationship and this parallel. We as RBTs and BCBAs can, in an effort to better pair or be fun, mimic these same types of behaviors as our example bio mom, and then inadvertently re-traumatize the learner. Okay, we're going to talk more about this and about how this is more in line with the code and like that specific language. But I wanted to start with these thoughts simply because I think that we kind of misunderstand sometimes how individualized we need to be. And I think that we need to look at holistic interventions and what we're truly doing within our whole practices. So what are some of your experiences with a similar example? Have you had similar experiences?
Yeah. Not necessarily in a foster home, but like a very tumultuous family dynamic. And situations with biomom were very contrived and very much like just giving the client things that they wanted to appease. And I have started thinking more and more about like the core yearnings, and that like core yearning of belonging was just like never met. And even, you know, with me and the RBT I had on the case, like when it came time for a session to be over, it was, am I going to see you tomorrow? Are you going to be here tomorrow? Am I going to see? And like that almost amp up of anxiety of like, when is this next moment coming?
Yep. And you can see how that's actually detrimental then to the client's actual progress, right? We've seen similar things happen, right? Because we're seeing like certain like supervisees be really paired with these fun things to where when they're removed, it's almost re-traumatizing, even if it's just one session or a day or two, right? It's really interesting, but it's something to be very aware of, right? Whenever we're working through what we consider these types of establishing the relationship practices. Cassie and I can tell you a story about one of our first learners that we ever worked with. And this was before we were really using trauma-informed care practices, because we didn't know, right? We didn't know any better. And we watched him just like go through these full-blown escalated meltdowns, and like these traditional responses were just escalating them that much more, and we couldn't quite figure out why. But then we realized that we were actually re-traumatizing him, right? Yeah, so I don't know if Cassie, if you wanted to share anything else about that one.
Yeah, I definitely didn't know any trauma-informed practice at all at that point in time. And I like cringe at myself because I did re-traumatize him, and I was part of that. And part of that also comes from like, you know, the RBTs always want to be the favorite. And so that comes into like, I want to be your favorite. I'm going to give you toys, and like not even thinking how that might detriment the client because you're so focused. I want to be the best. I want to be the favorite. And you're not even like considering, well, every time this seems to be happening and I'm not catching on to this.
Yeah, totally. Because you're not seeing the challenging behaviors that your teammates are seeing, right?
Yeah.
That's why the job of data analysis is really important. And we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. Okay, cool. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share or questions so far?
Kind of.
I can share.
Oh,
Cool.
Go ahead, Rosie.
So former client, like a few years back, you almost kind of like reframed it in my mind all over again because it's been a while. But same kind of thing, bio dad would show up unannounced and just walk into the house. And that is actually quite similar to what we do as like supervisors. We don't necessarily like let them know when we're coming out. We come out when we come out.
Yeah.
And that I realized that was happening after it was like, you know, he would get very startled when I came and like, you know, would hide for a little bit. And I finally put it together when mom's was mentioning, you know, like after 6 months, dad had like reappeared like the day before I came, and she was explaining like what the child did, and I was like, oh, that's pretty similar to like what he does when I come.
Yeah.
And so I had to like re-strategize and, you know, make sure that he knew when I was coming, so it wasn't so like jarring.
That's, I think, was eye-opening, I think, for a lot of us just now, including myself, because I hadn't thought about that perspective. But that's totally what ends up happening, right? Because we're so cool. Of course, that's what would happen, right? So that's really a really insightful share. So thank you for that. Cool. Anybody else? If not, we'll move on forward. Okay, cool. So again, going back to what our hope is, that was all just kind of foundational. I hope y'all did have a chance, or will have a chance to at least to download the literature and skim it. If not, it's really, really good. And it's helpful because it does give you that framework to help adjust your own practices. While you're at it, go ahead and get the Body Keep score because it's just really good. Slight disclaimer again, it's not behavior analytic at all. But when we talk about these kind of trauma-informed practices, we're also talking about how trauma impacts what we do as behavior analysts. We're not talking about being able to treat these learners' trauma, right? So we want to make sure that we're really being clear about that too. We're going to talk about that again, just in our code and what the wording is about that, because again, we want to ensure that what we're doing is trauma-informed, but also not claiming to treat something that we're not trying to treat. Cool. So again, that would be outside of our scope of practice and well beyond what the CEU is intended to cover. And I have no formal training with that. So this is very much about the environment and our behavioral adjustments and modifications and just our awareness so that we can bring our own practices within the field of ABA to make these children's lives not worse, but hopefully better by not re-traumatizing them. And if we have in the past, it's okay. It's never too late to change what you've been doing, and it's never too late to admit like, oh man, I made a mistake. That's human nature, and I wish more of us would admit to our faults. It's all right. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk what the core principles are that are in our code. I know it's like so boring. I get it, but it's also really important that we talk about these things, right? So let me pull them up. I just kind of have them right here for us. But, you know, it's also a PDF that's available, right? Available on the BACB's website. So let's talk about benefit others. Behavior analysts work to maximize benefits and do no harm. How do y'all interpret harm? Well, for me, harm also kind of covers re-traumatizing and trauma, right? So we want to make sure that we're accounting for all of those things by protecting the welfare of the clients, protecting the welfare and rights of other individuals, right? So those stakeholders, focusing on short-term and long-term. So not just getting out of the challenging behavior now, but what are the long-term effects of these professional activities? Actively identifying and addressing the potential negative impacts of their own physical and mental health on their professional activities. Actively identifying potential and actual conflicts of interest and working to resolve them in a manner that avoids or minimizes harm. Actively identifying and addressing factors, personal, financial, institutional, political, religious, cultural, etc., that might lead to conflicts of interest, misuse of their position, or negative impacts of their professional activities. And effectively and respectively collaborating with others in the best interests of those with whom they work, and always practicing the client's interest first. Well, that sounds pretty trauma-informed to me. What are y'all's interpretations of just benefit others?
I mean, I feel like we could stop there with the ethics code.
Amen.
You know, like point blank.
Tyra,
period.
take note. Just
Yeah.
kidding.
If you're not doing this part right here, go ahead and
Right.
get out.
If you're not doing this, then what are you doing?
Right.
Okay. Well, there's more, because there should be, but not should. I mean, like, really though, like if you're not abiding by just this, but our code does go even further. And this, again, is just our core principles. So treat others with compassion, dignity, and respect. So equitably, regardless of factors, right? So one of these factors too, to think about too, are national origin, race, religion, sexual orientation, social economic status, and other bases prescribed by law. Well, to me, that would also be survivors of trauma. We should be incredibly compassionate, right? Respecting privacy and confidentiality, respecting and actively promoting clients' self-determination to the best of their abilities, particularly when providing services to vulnerable populations. I don't think we talk about this enough, because we often find ways to exclude our learners from these types of conversations or from these types of interventions, right? When we're talking about self-determination, what does the client really want? Isn't that child-led? Never mind, that's a topic for another time. Also, acknowledging the personal choice in service delivery is important. So you're saying that they have a choice with ABA? We don't have to force something? That might be something to think about, right? It's also talking about the need for informed choices about services, right? And yes, self-determination, the process by which, sorry, it of course ended. Tyra, let's see, where did it go? Oh, chat. Well, now I can't see the chat. Okay. Check out the chat. Thank you,
It just
Tyra.
means that the self-determination is the process by which a person controls their own life.
Yes. So that's something that we have to think about whenever we're thinking about trauma-informed care practices as well. These person-centered care, right? So that is something that's really important that we often neglect. Okay, behaving with integrity. So honest and trustworthy manner, not misrepresenting ourselves, such as what I was talking about earlier, or engaging in fraud. Following through on obligations. So in other words, not just discontinuing services without some sort of transition plan, because that would also be re-traumatizing to somebody. Holding themselves accountable for their work, for their supervisees and their trainees, correcting errors in a timely manner. So if we're seeing something that's unethical that's happening that could be possibly re-traumatizing, we fix it and we hold ourselves accountable to that too. Of course, being knowledgeable of the BACB's regulatory requirements, actively working to create a professional environment to uphold these core principles and the standards of the code. And then respectfully educate others about the ethics requirements. That's kind of what we talked about right, at the beginning, right? We're not here to weaponize this. This is meant to help us. It's meant to protect us, just as it's meant to protect our clients and our learners who quite possibly have experienced trauma in their past. And then ensuring competence. Thanks for joining us, right? That's what we're doing right now. We're engaging in a continuing education so that we can further our learning and be aware of our own personal scope, professional scope of practice, but then also remaining in our current and increasing our knowledge within our best practices. So what we're doing right now is trauma-informed within itself, if we really think about it. And then remaining knowledgeable, right? So not just stopping here, but then going further to help yourself with these trauma-informed care practices, as well as aligning them with your ethical practices. And then being aware, working within, and continuing evaluating the boundaries of your competence. And then working to continually increase your knowledge and skills related to cultural responsiveness and service delivery to diverse groups. Well, what's a member of one of these diverse groups? Survivors of trauma, right? So we want to make sure that we're really being mindful of just our core, and that's where it starts, right? So does anybody have anything they want to add so far about what this is before we really start getting into what the framework of trauma-informed care practices are? Okay, cool. So again, this is exactly straight from the literature. Key steps include meeting client needs in safe, collaborative, compassionate manner, preventing treatment practices that re-traumatize people with histories of trauma who are seeking help or receiving services, building on the strengths and resilience of clients in the context of their environments and communities, and endorsing trauma-informed principles in agencies through support, consultation, and supervision of staff. So that's basically, I feel like, a nice summary that really pulls from a lot of what our core principles talk about, but in a simple paragraph form, if you will. What are your thoughts about that one? Just with the general framework that's been given.
I think this just really highlights that, like, first and foremost, and above all, it's really important that, like, we treat people like human beings and always take into consideration, like, their background, their trauma history, all that good stuff before we even, like, think about applying, like, ABA practices or traditional ABA. I think that's just, like, truly just the most important thing.
Oh yeah, I think so, definitely. Yeah, and I think there's right there is that kind of crossover, right? When we're talking about the person first, meeting the clients in a compassionate manner, or building on strengths, or support through support with consultation and supervision. All of these things are already in our code. Now, I think that this is pretty significant, in my opinion. So I want us now to kind of look at what these kind of bullet points are. And forgive me for a second, because I'm just going to fix that so that we can actually see the rest of the slide. Because for some reason the animation didn't work, but we need to see it all. Okay, here we go. Okay. So these are the standards. Become trauma aware and knowledgeable about the impact and consequences of traumatic experiences for individuals, families, and communities. That's very much like almost verbatim from here, right? Evaluate and initiate use of appropriate trauma-related screening and assessment tools. We're going to talk about assessments here in just a second, because obviously our code talks about it. And implement interventions from a collaborative, strengths-based approach, appreciating the resilience of trauma survivors, right? So this goes back to that self-determination. This goes back to that person and what they want for their lives. They don't want to necessarily be treated in a certain way that might make them feel as though they were never going to be able to move forward, but they also might want to have a say in what's happening rather than like barreling through with an escape extinction procedure, right? Learn more principles and practices that reflect trauma-informed care. The next thing that the standards talk about, and I'm just going to pull it up on my end here, are that, oh, that didn't work. Okay. We anticipate the need for specific trauma-informed treatment planning strategies that support the individual's recovery, right? So again, not practicing outside of our scope, but what can we do as behavior analysts to ensure that what we're doing within our treatment plan or treatment planning strategies is also going to be trauma-informed and with that individual's needs, specific needs in place, right? So again, maybe avoiding escape extinction or something else that might be re-traumatizing. Decrease the inadvertent re-traumatization that can occur from implementing standard organizational policies, procedures, and interventions with individuals, including clients and staff who have experienced trauma or are exposed to secondary trauma. So I think this actually talks more not only to us, but also with how we run our practices as a whole. So again, our code of ethics protects not only our learners, but the stakeholders and us, right? The behavior analysts. So this is something that we have to think about when we're thinking about this type of re-traumatization. Are our company's policies or our policies within our supervision practices possibly causing re-traumatization for our staff? And could that then be impacting their ability to provide trauma-informed care practices with our learners? I feel like that's kind of a loaded one in this one. And then, of course, evaluate and build a trauma-informed organization and workforce. So reiterating that. These are those key steps. What are your thoughts about that and what we already know about our code of ethics? Anyone? Can you find alignment, or should we go a little bit further so we can find? Okay, we'll move on then. Okay, so now when we think about this, I want us to think about why this matters. Again, because it does. We're going to reiterate this a lot. It seems like every time we're turning around, somebody's telling us that we needed to do better in the field of ABA, and they're really right. We're actually held to this high standard within our code. That's part of why we're continuously trying to increase our knowledge and our skills related to cultural responsiveness and service delivery to diverse groups. And those diverse groups are trauma survivors. This is part of 1.06. Okay, so we have to make sure that we're really being responsive to this. That's why it matters. But I also kind of wanted to share this little quote from the Body Keep score. Maltreatment is a chisel that shapes a brain to contend with strife, but at the cost of deep, enduring wounds. That's on page 151. Again, y'all should check it out. If you haven't read this book, I highly encourage you to do so. And if you read any part of it, read part 3 because it's all about children. And I think that you might find some good parallels within some of the case studies. Just throwing that out there. Okay. Anyway, trauma-informed care practices that are also in alignment with our code of ethics. I believe that this is also helps us be better behavior analysts, right? And that matters because not only of 1.06, but because it's simply the right thing to do, right? It's that value of helping others. That's why a lot of us got into this field, right? It was to help others, our value of helping. So we want to make sure that we're actually doing that. In this next section, we're going to talk about each of the codes or each of the sections within the code and how I feel they're most applicable within these standards that we just talked about, and why it matters. Because, well, not every client that we work with is going to have experienced trauma, right? But in that same regard, not every client we work with is going to report their full trauma history either. That's why it really does matter what we do. And it really does matter that our ethical practices are also trauma informed, right? So what if the caregiver wasn't necessarily like the most open during your initial interview, right? You don't have a lot of information to go off of, but you also aren't going to know if that child experienced any trauma because of maybe maternal neglect that may have happened, right? Or if there's something that they may be hiding within their home. You're not going to get those full reports. So it's just important that we're recognizing that even though we may not know the full story, we can still be helpful and not harmful in our practices. The other thing that I try to always keep in mind too is just perception is reality. And that's just a really rudimentary way of saying that just because you didn't perceive it as a traumatic experience doesn't mean that another person who was in that same situation didn't perceive it as trauma or experience it as trauma, right? So we have to think about that. We have to think about that we're not all going to experience the same situations the same way. I often hear BCBAs or RBTs argue that we have to go through like difficult experiences, and that's so true, right? Like we have to go through discomfort. That's part of the human experience, but not every difficult experience is going to be traumatic, and that's also true, right? But some are, and some distressing situations are truly traumatizing or re-traumatizing, whereas not themselves actually perfectly mimic the action that traumatized them originally, but there are elements that are there that are traumatizing, or right, or that were there that are now re-traumatizing. So that whole piece of do no harm, all of that really does matter. Okay. Now, the nitty gritty. 1.07, 1.10, 1.11, 1.12, 1.13, and 1.14 are all so well aligned with decrease the inadvertent re-traumatization that can occur from these policies, procedures, and interventions, right, from the previous slide. So we're going to look at each of these a little bit more closely. I don't think that most of us kind of look at trauma survivors as their own diverse group, but they are, right? Many of the examples listed in the code actually discuss either like symptoms of trauma or direct examples of traumatic situations, right? And then if you look at something else that's kind of important to think about, it's that these diverse backgrounds can actually cause stressful life events or trauma, right? So, and another key indicator to think about is that the absence of these differences, right? Of these like socioeconomic differences, of these cultural differences, of whatever experiences that may be part of their learner history that could be symptomatic of trauma or traumatic situations. Just because those didn't happen doesn't then mean that that person didn't experience trauma, right? So in other words, we don't know. Okay, so 1.07 actually gives us these protections. The biggest area where I think that we as BCBAs and clinical directors kind of fall short is passing this information and training onto our staff And I say that from my own experience. I know this. Why don't you know this? I've learned. I find myself having meetings all the time because I've messed up with not providing the training that I thought that I had, right? So this is why we do what we do. So this is, again, why we have to make sure that we're assessing our own bias towards what we perceive as trauma. We, in turn, then negate other people's experiences, and then we've kind of like pushed through with interventions. So when we're looking at 1.07, we're talking about assessing our own personal biases, right? Well, why would that matter for a trauma survivor? Well, it's because of everything that we just talked about, right? We perceive things differently. Everybody's experience is different, and we cannot tell somebody what they experienced was or was not trauma. That's out of our scope, first of all. Secondly, why not just take it at face value? You're not going to be doing any harm if you do. Okay. Now, I think 1.10 kind of further supports 1.07 by giving the action needed to resolve these issues, right? So that the client and the stakeholders are better supported within their trauma recovery or survival. And this is also when we notice that our own histories of trauma kind of may surface or interfere with our own ability to effectively provide behavior analytic services, right? Some of us are trauma survivors. We don't like to talk about it, but sometimes that's why we got in the field. But are we putting ourselves in a re-traumatizing situation because we're not necessarily going through what we need to? So an example of this might be, like, let's say that there is a survivor of domestic violence, right? And then they are, or maybe experiencing childhood food insecurity or anything that may have happened within their childhood or before they met you as their supervisor. All of these things are events that might be important to kind of think about, right? For supervisees stories. So it's important to think that maybe if we have somebody who might be a survivor, that they don't work with a learner who displays a lot of aggression, right? We want to make sure that we're promoting this team so that it's healthy for our staff and ethical for our supervisees, all parties, not just our learners, right? Maybe for the person who experienced food insecurity, we're not going to put them with a client who's going through a feeding protocol right now, right? That might be somewhat re-traumatizing to them. So these are some ways that we would say are nuanced, but are really important that we are addressing and addressing these issues as they're laid out, right? So what are your thoughts so far about what we've just talked about?
I mean, I said it in the chat, but I'll say it again.
Yeah.
Like, I just don't understand what is such a hard concept to grasp about, like, just taking someone's words at face value that, like, I have experienced a traumatizing event and, like, as such, it has shaped how I behave. But, like, I don't need to give you proof of that.
Right. Yeah. That in itself could actually be re-traumatizing, right?
Yeah.
That's something we talk about with the like when we talk about assessments, is not necessary. You don't have to ask somebody for their trauma history to assume that there's been trauma. Yeah. Okay. So anything else before we move forward with sections 1.11 through 1.14?
I think you just really did a great job highlighting that, like, with trauma, it's so personal and it's nothing that you can, like, compare from one person to another. And it can't ever be like a situation that it's like, well, I went through this, like, you're going to be fine, because everybody perceives things so differently and holds on to different situations so differently. So I think just recognizing and, like, losing the judgment of that towards others is just, like, essential in our field.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, totally.
I always go back just because, like, we literally have, like, the largest case study for the last 3 years of, like, how one singular event has, like, affected people so differently. So there's some people that are still coping and with their trauma of, like losing loved ones, people are going through divorces, like, and then there's some people that had a decent time. Some people are like, oh, I loved it. I loved being at home. So yeah. So I think you highlighting that is a really good point.
Right. I think that was a great example too, of like how we can interpret just the last few years with our perspectives, right? Okay, awesome. Well, sorry, my Slack messages are going crazy right now. Everything's okay. Okay, so sections 1.11, 112, 113, and 114, I think go without saying that they're aligned with being trauma informed, but let's go through them anyway. Oh, and I should let you know, I have a feeling we're going to go over. I don't think that I'm going to wrap this up in the next 12 minutes. So if you need to get off, I totally understand. There will be no hurt feelings, and it is recorded. So I'll definitely have this available for you. Okay, so let's go through the. Okay, 1.11, multiple relationships. Well, those effects might be obvious to some, but I think that we often forget how multiple relationships or dual relationships are formed. And they're usually not formed with intent, especially not with ill intent, right? So I think that's where that evaluation piece really does come into play. We have to be evaluating our own impact on our learners' behavior. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about before with that team. This goes to data analysis. So when we see that data are skewed amongst team members, we can tell one is the favorite RBT. What is that doing to the client's progress? That shows us something, right? I can look and say like, okay, this RBT has no challenging behavior. This RBT and this RBT have a ton of challenging behavior. Here's what the session note says. Oh man, I think we may possibly be on the cusp of causing some harm with a potential dual relationship that wasn't intended to be a dual relationship, but because of those pairing practices, that's what's happened, right? So we have to make sure that then we fix that. Well, part of that is with our code of ethics, right? So we'll talk more about some things that we can do within those pairing practices, within our code, within the different sections, right? Okay, so 1.12 may also seem as though it's not quite as aligned, but this is kind of what I was talking about just a second ago. So these pairing practices, I think I might be the only BCBA who misses the black and white no gift giving policy, and this is why. I found that it was more protecting of our clients. And for individuals who rely on gift giving, right? When we go back to that example of BioMom, we have that issue then happening. And I think that then has been somewhat misinterpreted by our behavior analysts in our field. So we want to make sure that we're really being careful about what we are, how we are interpreting the $10 maximum. Throwing that out there. Okay. And I also think about often the learner that Cassie and I worked with, mostly because he would engage in a lot of property destruction and then have huge escalated outbursts, right? If somebody brought something to him because it was re-traumatizing to him. And again, we didn't know, but now we know. So I just want us to be really aware of 1.12 whenever we are going through our establishing of the therapeutic relationship and making sure that we're really being really well trauma informed within that. Okay, so I don't know if I really have to go over 1.13 and 1.14. That if you are in a coercive, exploitative, or sexual relationship, please know that's not trauma informed. Does anybody have questions about those two? Cool, just checking. Just making sure. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. That's right, Tyra. Good. All clear. We're good. Okay. So we're going to go through these next little ones a little bit more quickly. So I'm going to briefly touch on the responsibility in public statements and in research. As far as public statements are concerned, it's really important, again, just not to say that you can help treat people or treat trauma, right? That can also be re-traumatizing to an individual who may have sought your services. Got it? So be really clear with how you are putting yourself out there. And it's in our, and for our responsibility in research, we have to ensure that the informed consent truly outlines what may occur as with that risk benefit analysis, right? So if a candidate may have an adverse response to any aspect of that research project, maybe it's best not to include them, right? Or maybe without the proper safeguards, we need to admit that that might be outside of our scope of practice. Okay, so just putting that out there as far as that little disclaimer. Okay. I needed water because this next one's a big area. As you can tell, we've got a lot of bullet points, but this is the bulk of what we do, right? So consequently, this has a ton of considerations with being trauma informed. Providing effective treatment. 2.01 has very specific wording for what I want us all to read together. And you don't have to because I have it pulled up. Well, you can pull it up yourself if you want to, but I'm going to read it out loud. It's designed to maximize outcomes for and protect all clients, stakeholders, supervisees, trainees, and research participants from harm. And again, we are regarding re-traumatization as harm, right? So when we're considering this next piece, that it discusses our scope of practice as relevant to our education and practice, right? So we want to make sure that what we're doing here is that we are, oh, hold on, sorry. And again, we want to regard, we want to see, oh, here we go. Now I'm back on track. Okay, so this next little piece talks about our scope of practices as relevant to our education and training. So as trauma-informed providers, it's important that we communicate about the services that we provide and that we also don't oversell, just like we were talking about before. So we also want to make sure that this, as is outlined in 2.08, that we remember that ABA usually involves multiple people implementing the same interventions, right? That's why we have those fidelity checks. So you want to make sure that you're including the fact that behavior drift can happen. How do you think behavior drift might account for re-traumatization? A little bit, right? So this is your part of evaluating so that you can then make sure that you're accounting for if somebody is possibly moving away from that code of ethics, that you're bringing them back, right? You're educating them. It's also important that you're explaining the assessment procedures, as there are some insurance companies that require that you do some other assessments that might not be very well trauma informed. So for example, have any of you had to administer the PSI-4 or the Parent Stress Index, right? If you are a newly divorced caregiver or a caregiver who may have been raised in a very religious home, some of these questions might be incredibly triggering or offensive to you. So this would be that time and space when you're talking about your assessments to inform the caregivers of that, right? It's kind of important that we're thinking about these when we're thinking about those assessment practices too. Cool. Okay, so when we're talking about the key concept of implementing interventions from a collaborative and strengths-based approach, it's very much rooted in section 2.09 and 2.10. We cannot possibly know the whole story without collaboration, right? We'll still only know part of it with collaboration, but we'll at least know more of it. And we focus on the caregiver and the therapist interviews a ton before we even begin to observe and assess the learner, right? That's how we're really going to make sure that we're going to get accurate information. But that can also tell us a little bit more than what like those kinds of assessments can tell us more than like what a normative assessment might be able to tell us, like those normative numbers. And then, sorry, I got a little sidetracked by the chat. Sorry, but they can tell us a little bit more about like the expressiveness about that individual. And I will say then that also will include the stakeholders more, which would then lend to those appropriate efforts, right? So that they're actually involved. So when we're involving the caregivers with those interviews, but we're also involving them in like, this is what we do with our observation process. This is why we're doing this observation process, because we understand that our observations are going to give us a little bit more information than these interview assessments that we have to do because insurance tells us to, and because TRICARE is a nightmare. Right? So those are the things that we have to talk about whenever we're talking about these kind of trauma-informed decisions too with stakeholders. As mentioned with our research, informed consent is important, right? But it's also important that we're going to look at this sentence in 2.11. Behavior analysts are responsible for obtaining assent from clients. Oh my God, I thought assent was a buzzword. Huh. Well, I do know this. Assent is different than consent. The stakeholders give consent, right? Assent is different. This is what we get from our learners. There's been about this, right? So in my opinion, the simplest way to define this with our learners is compliance without protest or refusal. It's smiling while you work. It's happy, relaxed, engaged. It's not forcing the client through a trial because you know they can do it or because they've done it before. It's in their repertoire. Assent takes evaluation of our own behaviors, which we as behavior analysts really hate to do sometimes, right? Okay. Any questions so far? What do y'all think about assent as part of trauma-informed care practices?
Again, it's like, if you're not starting there, what are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, assent is one of those it's one of those things that it feels like the right thing to be focusing on, but we need some more research to inform our practices. And we need more practices to inform our research. So, focusing on it and wrestling with what are the indicators of assent or assent withdrawal, or where is that gray area between escape and avoidance of reasonable things, right? Like if you've got escape and avoidance, can you first make things less aversive or what have you, right? Obviously, but like there's so much more work to be done from every angle. But it's one of those things from a researcher's perspective that it feels like if you are endeavoring to assess assent or assent withdrawal, it's like not a bad thing. Like, but that's good. Do that, right? It's like drinking water is good for you. Just do it. Exactly how much? No, I know that depends. We have to get more information.
Yeah, I think
so yeah, it feels like a no-brainer.
It feels like a no-brainer, but again, the research is lacking. And that's one of those things that like there was like a big post the other day about like evidence-based practices, right? So yeah, wholeheartedly agree. Cool. It's just after 6. We have a little bit more to go through. Does anybody need a stretch or go to the bathroom? Okay, cool. We'll power it through them. Okay. So these next 3 sections, I think, are really also pretty parallel to the foundational concepts of trauma-informed care. So this is about choosing the assessment and the intervention. So why we actually do have like a CEU about assessments about trauma-informed care practices assessments that I really kind of enjoy. We talk a lot about its applications within ACT, so that's just kind of a sidebar. But when we're selecting our interventions, we want to make sure that we're, again, using those strength-based approaches, because 2.14 and 2.15 point out that the intervention selected must best meet the diverse needs, context, and resources of the client and stakeholder. Well, that also is talking about, right, social validity when we get right down to it. Social validity then is kind of what the underlying thing of what we're really talking about when we're talking about trauma-informed care practices. So how are we going to best meet those diverse needs? Well, we also, as behavior analysts, have to consider relevant factors. With regards to behavior change interventions, behavior analysts must focus on minimizing risk or harm to the client or stakeholders. There's a little bit of a typo, by the way, in the code right there in that sentence, but it's okay, because I'm sure everybody now really reads it. It's weird, right, Rachel, how it just keeps saying the word harm and like doing no harm. You're exactly right. Man, it's just so crazy. So again, we just keep focusing on this. And again, this also keeps coming up, Rachel, which is continually evaluate. That means that we're always assessing what we're doing. And this means that we modify or discontinue the behavior change intervention in a timely manner if ineffective. Here's my 2 cents on this. If the child is in distress from the behavior change procedure for an extended period of time, it is not an effective procedure. If it's still happening for an extended period of time, it's not an effective procedure. Or again, maybe look at what might be happening. Do we have our favorite RBT versus somebody who's also a fantastic RBT that has somehow not been conditioned the same, right? Something else to evaluate continually. Okay. Now, I kind of want to hear your thoughts here about 213 and 215 through 215, because in my opinion, we could go further with our wording here to better protect our clients and our stakeholders and staff when considering response blocking or the use of restraints, right? So what do y'all think whenever we have any of y'all read the code recently? Anybody? I mean, I think a couple of you probably have. I'm just gonna look at.
We did a whole podcast episode on our favorite parts.
I know, that's what I was saying. I know a couple of you have.
Yeah.
So when we think about 213 through 215, selecting, designing, and implementing assessments, selecting, designing, and implementing behavior change interventions, and minimizing the risk of behavior change interventions, what are your thoughts about how we could possibly even take this further with our research, with our application, with our trauma-informed care practices?
I mean, I would love to see research lines where, okay, we started with this intervention and we noticed an increase in what we're outlining as a trauma response, whether that's escape or avoidance. Instead of, we've defined this as a function of escape. Okay, but we're digging deeper into that function of escape. And this behavior has been elicited by this behavior change program or this intervention. So we changed it up entirely. We're doing something completely different.
Yeah.
Then what happens?
Yeah, the phase line. Exactly. I think you're exactly right. I think that we need to be documenting these things, right, a little bit more accurately with really what we're seeing so that we can advocate for these changes, right? And I say that too because when I look at 215 specifically, and y'all know how I feel about really restrictive and punitive based procedures, but I think our wording could go a little bit further, because all it says is that we must continually evaluate and document the effectiveness of restrictive or punishment-based procedures. Well, I think anybody, You can rationalize a lot. Thanks for joining us. I think you can rationalize that a lot, right? So I think that what we can do is take that a little bit further to protect our clients. But that's my own my own little opinion, and that was this little side note. Okay, so 2.18. Now, we talked a little bit. Oh yeah, Rose, go ahead.
I was trying to like formulate it so it's not too long, but like all of those code items, like what I think of is like how a lot, I'm not even going to use the phrase old ABA because it's still happening, but like compliance-based therapy, and how like, well, you have to get through like the extinction burst and then they comply a lot better. And then hearing in the past, at past companies, people refer to it as like, oh, you got to break them in, you got to break them like a horse, you know, all of that stuff. And that like still, it like still rattles me like in my bones. And a couple companies around here are closing. And so we have a whole wave of kids on our wait list now from these companies that still do that. And so like reading, you know, just last month, like, he was non-compliant and then he aggressed, and I'm like, well, why do you think he aggressed? Like,
Right.
So yeah, so like all of those code items, it's like we could definitely be going further of like, are you really evaluating your intervention if you had to go through a huge extinction burst that a kid that was never aggressive became aggressive? Like, are you really evaluating that? Or you're like, oh, gotta keep on breaking the horse? Like,
Right. Or should I just keep barreling all through? I think that's such a great point, because you're right. Like, I think that's a lot of how people look at establishing the therapeutic relationship, right? It's like, oh, but I also have to go through this. No, you don't.
And is it really like, is it an extinction burst?
Or is it a
are we
power
teaching-
struggle?
Is it a power struggle? And are we teaching learned helplessness?
yeah, we're teaching them to just give up. People are
Yep.
going to move your body whether you like it or not.
Yeah. You can be manipulated.
I'll try to stay off my ascent soapbox because
No, you're good. I think that's fantastic. Okay. So 2.18, I think, is kind of briefly mentioned in 2.15, kind of about evaluating interventions, and specifically with the clients and stakeholders. That itself is trauma informed, right? That is another way to know if an intervention is working. Do the caregivers say that it's working? Right? Does the client feel like it's working? Something to think about. That's trauma informed. I also like to think of this too as like self-monitoring. So our clients can report to us how things are going. Like, we have one learner who graphs her redirections so that it's like part like her own self-monitoring program, right? But that's also a way that we know that she's part of what we've done. It's trauma informed, but then it's also a way that we know if this is working or not. Okay, it's also really important to tell those learners, which I've had to do with this one that we were just talking about, that it didn't work. I was wrong. I said that we should do it this way, and I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I have had to do that with her before, right? Where I said, like, yeah, I really messed up before. We're moving forward. Here's what I'd like to do. Does that work for you? You are at the center of what we are doing. This is part of my evaluation. This is part of that process. So another part of that is if a behavior analyst believes that someone else's behavior is negatively impacting the client, we have to address it. So it doesn't tell us how, but that's also because it does take evaluation to figure out how, right? Like, they can't tell us this is exactly what you're supposed to do, because it takes that assessment, and each assessment then indicates a different outcome, right? So what's actually happening, and then what's going to be the best solution for those parties, and are all parties going to be protected? This might mean that you're going to be moving teams around. This might mean that you're going to be rearranging the environment. This might be conducting fidelity checks across team members, or having a team meeting to make sure everybody's on the same page. This might be removing somebody from the environment or from the team to prevent the possibility of re-traumatization or limiting the amount of time somebody's with them to prevent re-traumatization, so that you can build up the relationships on the rest of the team, right? These are just some possible solutions based on our own evaluation processes. So thoughts about this past section that we just kind of went through about responsibility and practice. Cool. So responsibility to clients and stakeholders. Our responsibilities are to the clients. This first one is our responsibilities to the clients is that if we see something, right, against the law, we report it. We're mandated reporters. Yes, we support the stakeholders and the caregivers. We help them. We give them caregiver support. We give them parent training, but we speak when we notice harm, right? This is how we also decrease inadvertent re-traumatization. We are aware of our clients and their behaviors and those changes in their behavior. We consult with others when we need, right? This is something that I do often as someone who strives to be trauma informed, and recognizing that it's not something that I specialize in and that I'm not a specialist in trauma recovery. So I reach out to my colleagues and my friends who are. I ask them. I have a very good colleague and friend who is in Vermont and another one who's in Tennessee, and I talk to them all the time. I seek out further learning from them so that I can make sure that our practices are further in line with trauma-informed care practices. They're much more knowledgeable about trauma and its impact on behavior. And so I reach out to them. We should all do things like that, where we are collaborating with outside professionals so that we can make sure that we are increasing our education and our knowledge for the sake of our clients. I hope that is really clear. It's kind of a little soapbox for me. And I don't think that we do it enough, in all honesty. Just sidebar. Okay, so 3.06 should really be part of our everyday practices. And it's kind of what happens within our evaluation process, in that we determine ABA isn't the right, when we're determining that ABA isn't the right fit, right? What do? We can't just drop them. Cassie and I've had this situation. We very much realize, like, ooh, we are in a possibly situation where we're either going to be practicing outside of our scope, re-traumatizing a learner, or just being flat out ineffective. We were in the ineffective point. So we couldn't just drop this person because that would be re-traumatizing to them. So what we did is 3.16. We took the appropriate steps to minimize disruptions. We didn't drop them cold turkey. We made sure that we coordinated care. Caregivers found the appropriate therapist for them. And then we continued providing one session a week so that we didn't just drop them, and that we could make sure then that that therapist who took over the case, who wasn't a behavior analyst, but it was much more in their scope, understood what we had been working on with them, right? That was how we were able to transition in, I believe, a trauma-informed way. What are some other ways that we might need to look at minimizing these disruptions whenever we recognize that maybe it's not for, ABA might not be for this particular individual?
I had a learner that I worked with at a different company, and she was enrolled for ABA, and we were on the same targets that we started with her a year later, the exact same targets. And we kept, the BCBA I worked for kept fighting for her to be there because she adamantly believed that ABA could help, but it was like, nope, she has not made progress. She can't do the fundamental skills that she needs to be able to do to even participate and get the skills mastered in ABA. We shouldn't be the first priority right now. And we had to kind of talk with mom, or I talked with my BCBA about what I thought should be done. And you know, sometimes those circumstances happen, but it's better for that client that we're making sure their progress is continual.
Right. And that sometimes their progress isn't an ABA or isn't going to happen with ABA, right? And what are some other ways that like y'all think about like appropriately transitioning?
Communication is key.
Yeah. That's how you prevent the re-traumatization, right? Like let them know like what you know about this history.
Yeah.
Well, if you know that they engage in these behaviors under these conditions, let that person know.
Yeah.
So that they don't inadvertently re-traumatize them, right? Make sure that treatment plan is really clear. Like this is what happens. These are the behaviors that we were working on, but these were the ones that we saw whenever this happened, right? Okay. This last little bit is about supervision. So it is our responsibility to build a trauma-informed workplace, right? As part of that trauma-informed, like the key cornerstones. So that also means that it's our duty to train our supervisees in these practices. However, we also have to consider our own personal trauma histories as well, right? So this is part of 4.06. Trainings are individualized for each supervisee or trainee and their circumstances. Their circumstances are their histories, their trauma stories, their triggers, their environment. We have to account for these when we're training, right? We talked about this earlier when we were talking about like if we needed to adjust teams. Well, this is why. We're accountable for what happens, as 4.04 tells us, right? So this is a lot. This is a lot of information in one code of ethics for behavior analysts, right? These were a lot, like this was just half, right? On this slide right here, this is just half of what we went through as far as how many sections within our code are very much in line with these trauma-informed care practices, right? Like I mentioned, here you have access to all of the references with the exception of the Body Keep score, but just buy it. You should have it on your bookshelf anyway. Right? Like it's just, you should. And just download the references. A couple of them are over 300 pages, but they're also really beneficial. They're also mentioned in the Rajaraman study. So that's kind of something to think about too. Like what he based his research off of is also what we were working on with today. So, do y'all have any questions? Any last comments about our code of ethics being trauma informed?
I feel like this is a soapbox I never want to get off of either. Like, it's literally right here in our code of ethics that we have to, one, behave in a compassionate way when we're delivering services, and two, we have to, we're obligated to use a trauma-informed lens. And again, like everyone is mentioning, we are not treating trauma.
Right.
It's just a lens that we are putting on as we interact with our clients that they are
It's just
carrying.
a protective thing.
Yeah.
It's a
And
protection
understanding
for not only our clients, but also for our supervisees and ourselves, right? There's so much in this, like almost everything in our code was also like, oh, by the way, think about how this also affects you.
Yeah.
And your ability to provide ethical services.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Just something that I thought about when we were talking about this is I know that trauma isn't always reported. And sometimes trauma isn't recognized until later, but the body tends to hold on to some of that trauma. So if like the client that Meg and I both worked with, it was like around the holidays, every single time some behavior started happening, and we can still record and document that. We're not going to treat it, but that might be something to indicate to us, my gosh, there's something going on right here, right now. And nothing externally like is really causing this. What could be causing this more? Delve in deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think about my own behavior around the holidays,
Mhm.
especially this last holiday. Like my behavior was very different this holiday season. And like if people had like been kind of in my presence, they would have noticed a shift in how I was behaving. And that had a lot to do with a lot of things. But you know, you move on and whatnot. But having that lens and approaching every situation with an understanding of like, I might not know. I don't have to know the function in this moment.
No, absolutely not. And it could just be more than the function,
Mhm.
right? Cool. Any other thoughts?
I think just for people that are newer in the field, it can be really hard to kind of like align trauma-informed care with just looking at like the ethics code. I know it seems like pretty obvious to like some people and people that have been in the field for longer. So I think like taking this time to like really align that is so important, especially for like newer BCBAs and newer people in the ABA field, because like I said, like traditionally ABA hasn't always been like this. So
Yeah,
it's so
totally. But you know what's so interesting too is like that's our code was just updated in January of 2022, right? It's been a year. How many of you had read it this last year with the update? Cool. How many of you actually then figured out like a way to like modify your practices based on what you read?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's something to think about, right? Like we don't often like go back to things that we've already read, right? If we've already modified something, we're not going to go back to the thing that made us modify it. But if we don't, we might be missing some pretty big information sometimes, right? Especially when we look at like through a different lens, kind of like what Rachel was talking about. So in that trauma-informed lens, like why is that important? Are there things that are actually like pretty well aligned? Well, I think today we proved that there are, right? We found like we found very specifically like word for word parallels, right? So we could see that what we're doing here is supposed to be trauma informed, right? When we're doing it the right way, but we're just not always doing it the right way. And we often get stuck in that black and white mentality, I think. Well, this is the reinforcement procedure. This is the response procedure. This is what I'm supposed to be doing in this procedure. And we're forgetting about the person behind the procedure, right? Cool. Anything else before we wrap up?
Well, I think these are the kinds of things I want to bring into this new position that I'm in. Like if I'm coming into contact with RBTs and like people who are in a graduate program and getting their fieldwork hours and they're meeting with me, like this is what the stuff we're going to talk about. And you know, I'm going to get them in contact with the ethics code and make those parallels of like this is why and this is how.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I said this before, like this totally came because we were like, oh crap, there's some things that are going on. And we have to address them. And it really came from like a place of education. But yeah, it's important that we do this because a lot of our clients and our learners are from these diverse backgrounds. Cool. Well,
I had one
go
thought.
ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna hold it, but I was like, maybe other people should hear it. So I was thinking, I mean, we all know it really like stinks when like RBTs quit or like go on to like another company or something. But sometimes we even change RBTs, you know, for generalization or maybe what you were saying about like creating a dual relationship with like the favorite technician. But like examining how that is traumatizing our clients. Maybe they have like abandonment issues, maybe they're in foster care, maybe they've lost someone in their lives. So really like looking at that before we're like, okay, like they're too close, we should separate them, or for generalization or something, just really examining how to do that without re-traumatizing the client.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the biggest struggles, right? Is like, and that's kind of what I was talking about, like with like team adjustments, like maybe like not removing somebody completely, if that's going to then like re-traumatize, but then like maybe like fading so that you can bolster up some other relationships, right? So like essentially like you're not removing the favorite, you're just reducing. It's like a DRL, right?
Yeah.
So like it's a lower rate, and you're trying to increase then that those relationships then with the other team, so that then it's not so skewed. Because the hope is that, right, as soon as the person who recognizes that they're possibly like the cause of this, that they've evaluated their own behavior, right, and that they're recognizing what they can do, which, right, one of those things would be talking positively about other team members, or it might be not bringing a toy all the time, right? Or not blatantly violating 1.11, those types of things. So we want to make sure that we're really being helpful, right? With how we're using our code of ethics so that, again, we're educating as opposed to like weaponizing. Yeah. Cool. Well, obviously this went to be an hour and a half, so we'll do a 1.5 units. Woohoo! 1.5 ethics. Yay. That's always so helpful. Okay. Well, I hope y'all have a wonderful night. Thanks for sticking on with me. Okay, cool. Y'all have a great night. Bye.
Bye. I'm sending you my curly girl routine.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Meg.
Bye.
Bye.